नहीं, मेरी साइड से नहीं हो रही, जैन की साइड से हो रही है।
ओके फिट है, चलो ठीक है। अभी मुस्तफिज बस ध्यान रखना, कोई लाइबा आएगी तो उसे होस्ट बना देना, ठीक है?
ठीक है।
ठीक है।
मारूफ, मेरा वीडियो ऑन नहीं हो रहा।
अब ऑन करें, अब ऑन करें। हाँ, अभी ये ऑफ मत कीजिएगा वीडियो, क्योंकि हमने वीडियो ऑफ ऑन करना सबके लिए रिस्ट्रिक्ट किया हुआ है, तो जिनकी वीडियो ऑन है सिर्फ वही कर पाएंगे, ठीक है?
चलो ठीक है।
ऑलराइट, सो हर कोई अभी थोड़ी देर में ज्वाइन कर लेगा, मैंने अलाउ कर दिया सबको। Assalamu alaikum everyone. We'll just wait a couple of minutes and then we'll start the session.
Osama?
Yes, yes.
Some background music to below.
Why choose the
On some background music to below.
यार रजा बाजार की हम जाना
Okay, we have a couple of participants. I think we can start. So I'll basically start with myself and the organization Hum-Aahang. Myself, I'm Maruf Taj. I'm the co-president of Hum-Aahang. And Hum-Aahang is a student-led society at LUMS dedicated to promoting progressive values such as equality, peace, freedom, tolerance, and so on. Our efforts mainly circle around celebrating the diversity of opinion, ethnicity, religion, culture, gender, sexuality, and we support movements of resistance for peace and for human rights and so on. Recently, we have also started focusing on art as a medium of communication. For example, we have started a discussion circle series on named Art as Existence, and I'll share that with you also in the chat so you can check this out. Also, we also hold discussion circle series every other week in which we provide or try to provide a safe space to intellectuals and intellectual wanderings and philosophical discussions. So you can join those discussions also. I'll connect you with that. Coming to today's session, the main purpose, as you all know, is के जो भी अभी करंट सिचुएशन है अफगानिस्तान की, दैट वी सी अफगान जो प्रेसिडेंट्स हैं, अशरफ गनी, वो मुल्क छोड़ गए हैं, अफगान गवर्नमेंट कोलैप्स हो चुकी है, एंड करंटली तालिबान रूल जो है रूल वहाँ पे अपनी हाइट्स और पावर जो है अपनी उनकी बढ़ रही है. And in current situation, we believe that it's very important for us all to engage with those ideas and engage with the people who are suffering and experiencing all these things. So just a heads up, waiting for a couple of minutes for others also, and I'll briefly start with the session, that how it's organized. So the session is divided into two parts. The first say in the first session we'll engage with the students from Afghan community. They are from Afghanistan and currently studying in Pakistan. Most of them have relatives back there in Afghanistan, in districts like Kandahar and Helmand. And in the next session, we'll invite our guests, scholars, which are from universities like Oxford and Johns Hopkins, and also our respected scholar from Institute of Strategy and Strategic Studies. So without any ado, I'll introduce my student guests. So first up, we have Ahsan Tareen. Ahsan, he is secretary of Pashtun Organization and currently a student at Bolan University of Medical and Health Sciences. Then we have RoohUllah Khan, a member of Pashtun Student Federation. He is doing LLB from University of Balochistan in Pasheen. And then we have Mohammad Osama Kakar from from Quaid-e-Azam University, currently studying politics and international relations. Now, and our last guest, Sahar, she is currently studying at Bolan University. She is a part of Afghan Hazara community. So for now, let me start the discussion with the question to Ahsan. Ahsan, so basically आप बलूचिस्तान में रहते हैं, आपने पंजाब का भी विजिट किया है, आप अफगानिस्तान भी गए हैं, आप वहीं पे उनके आपके रिलेटिव्स वगैरह हैं, तो आप कुछ हमारे लिए कंपैरिजन कर सकते हैं कि कैसे पाकिस्तानी जो हैं पश्तून लोगों को ट्रीट करते हैं, कैसे ये बैक इन अफगानिस्तान आप ट्रीट किए जाते हैं बाय द अफगान कम्युनिटी एज अ परहैप्स डू दे कंसीडर यू अ पाकिस्तानी, like how does the border affect your identity? अभी आप एहसन आप अभी आवाज नहीं आ रही।
जी आवाज
जी जी
मारूफ जी, आपका सवाल ये था कि जो हम पश्तून जो मैं खुद पंजाब में हमने एफएससी अपना इंटरमीडिएट किया, कि आपने ऐसे पूछा कि पंजाब में हमें कैसे ट्रीट किया जाता है पठानों को, क्योंकि पंजाब में जो है वो, अगर मैं मेन इशू पर बात कर लूँ, मैंने आपको बताया भी था उस दिन, पंजाब में अगर कोई पठान जाता है वहाँ पढ़ने के लिए, और अगर इन केस आप अपने राइट्स की बात करें, इवन पूरे पाकिस्तान में अगर आप कराची जाते हो, पठान में होते हो, जहाँ भी आप जाते हो, तो अगर आप अपने राइट्स की बात करते हो, तो मतलब अगर आप ये कहते हो कि भाई ये सही नहीं हो रहा, ये गलत हो रहा है, सो पीपल लोग ये कहते हैं कि भाई आप नमक हराम हो, ये हो वो हो, आप पाकिस्तान आप ये देता है, पाकिस्तान आपको वो देता है। भाई जब जो सोवियत यूनियन के इन्वेजन के बाद जब पठान जो अफगानिस्तान से पाकिस्तान आए थे, उनको उनकी मद में यूनाइटेड जो नेशन है और दूसरी जो कंट्रीज है वो पाकिस्तान को बहुत ज़्यादा एड्स देते हैं, मगर वो उनमें से अगर मैं आपको बताऊं कि 1% भी इन अफगानियों पर खर्च नहीं हुआ है। जो मैं आपको अगर कभी मैं आपको वीडियो का भेज देता हूँ आपको, जो पशीन में अफगानियों का कैंप है, वहाँ पर अगर आप जाओगे, वहाँ पर ये लोग, इन लोगों का जो तर्ज ज़िंदगी है, वो लोग जिस मसाइल का शिकार है, मतलब अगर उनको पीने के लिए पानी मुयसर नहीं है, वहाँ पर अस्पताल, स्कूल, कॉलेजेस इसका नाम निशान तक नहीं है, इवन अभी तक कोई जो इलेक्ट्रिसिटी का जो भी कोई सिस्टम होता है वो वहाँ तक नहीं गया। सो 30-40 साल से ये लोग इधर रह रहे, पाकिस्तान ने इनको कम्प्लीटली निगलेक्ट किया हुआ। और एक मैं किसी से सुन रहा था भाई कि जो एक अगर कोई बंदा वो वार स्ट्राइकन लोग होते हैं, अगर वो किसी मुल्क में पनाह लेता है, 25 साल के बाद उस मुल्क में उसको शरीयत दी जाती है, मगर यहाँ पर इन लोगों को कोई राइट्स नहीं दिए गए। शरीयत तो दूर, सिटीजनशिप तो दूर की बात है। और दूसरी बात ये है कि जो लोग यहाँ रहते हैं, वो जो 20-30 साल से यहाँ रहते हैं, जैसे कि हम लोग हैं, वो अगर वापस अफगानिस्तान जाते हैं, न तो अफगानिस्तान उनको एक्सेप्ट करता है, नहीं पाकिस्तान उनको एक्सेप्ट कर रहा है। सो बात ये है कि न तो वो लोग वहाँ कह रहे हैं, न यहाँ कह रहे। सो इस चीज़ पर, इन लोगों की ज़िंदगी पर, और जो आने वाले इनका जनरेशन है, یہ بہت زیادہ افیکٹڈ ہے اس چیز سے.
صحیح. میں اسے اس سوال سے کنیکٹ کرنا چاہوں گا، اور یہ کویسچن جو ہے میرا وہ اسامہ، روح اللہ، احسن اور سحر آپ سب سے ایڈریس ہے کہ سو بیسیکلی افغانستان جو ہے وہ ڈیورنٹ لائن کو نہیں ایکسیپٹ کرتا، اور اس کے کنیکشن میں دے کلیم کے جو کے پی کے ایریاز ہیں، جو بلوچستان کے ایریاز ہیں، وہ افغانستان کا حصہ ہونے چاہیے. سو آئی وانٹ ٹو نو کہ لائک کنسیڈرنگ کہ ابھی طالبان کا جو ایک رائز ہوا ہے، وہ پاور میں آئے ہیں، and I think they will try to kind of reclaim those places. So اس میں ایک افغانی کا اور آپ کا کیا سٹانس ہے کہ like how do you connect with that heritage, and do you like think that that's what should be done? کوئی بھی شروع کر سکتا ہے. اسامہ آپ اس پہ بات کرنا چاہیں تو.
السلام علیکم معروف بھائی، میری آواز کلیئر؟
جی جی.
یار مجھے تھوڑا نیٹ کی ایشو ہے، اگر آواز میں تھوڑا وہ ہو تو سوری فار دا انکنوینس، اسی وجہ سے میں کر کے چھت پر آیا ہوں تھوڑا نیٹ کی ایشو کی وجہ سے. سو کمنگ ٹو کوشچن دیٹ یو آسک دیٹ Durand line or other Afghan relations. So I would start from the Pak-Afghan relations. پاک افغان جو ریلیشنز ہے، اگر ہم 1947 سے شروع کریں، 1947 سے پاک افغان کی جو ریلیشنز ہے، مطلب 2 to 3 factors have determined Pak Afghan relations and have played a key role in up and downs of the Pak Afghan relation. جس میں سے the most important thing جو آپ نے ڈیورنٹ لائن کی بات کی، the most important factor between Pakistan and Afghan, and the most important issue for them, for both of the countries, for both states, is the Durand line. I would not go deep in the historical background of the Durand line, that will be explained by Durullah, but I will just explain that how Durand line has affected the Afghan citizens and also the Pashtun community in Pashtun belt in Pakistan. So the question here is the 2 to 3 factors have shaped the Pak-Afghan relation. First one is Durand line. The second thing is the Pashtunistan movements in Pakistan. And the third thing that agar hum analyze kare from 1947 till yet, Pakistan has played a key role in gaining her strategic goals in Afghanistan, in supporting the jihadist groups, in supporting the Taliban, or supporting the 90s Mujahideen against the Soviet invasion. It was just all a part of her foreign policy, and the main goal behind this was to bring pro-Pakistan governments in Kabul, and the most important thing was to resolve the conflict of this border issue. Now the border issue historical background اس میں مطلب وہ جو سب سے زیادہ نقصان ہوا ہے وہ پشتون ایتھنک گروپس کو ہوا ہے، پشتون ایتھنک گروپس کو بھی ہوا ہے، اور ٹو سم ایکسٹینٹ بلوچ بھی آلموسٹ 3 کنٹریز میں ڈیوائڈ ہوئے ہیں، سم ان افغانستان، سم ان ایران اینڈ سم ان پاکستان. اسی طرح پشتون جو ایتھنک گروپ ہے جو ایک بیلٹ تھا ڈیورنگ 18 or 19th century, I think so, I cannot remember the date. اس میں سے جو سب سے زیادہ نقصان ہوا پشتون ایتھنک گروپ کو، اس کو ڈیوائڈ کیا گیا مطلب انٹو 2 sections. 1 section گیا پاکستان کے پارٹ میں، اور سیکنڈ سیکشن گیا افغانستان کے پارٹ میں. سو ڈیورنٹ لائن جو ہے وہ کافی حد تک پاک افغان ریلیشن کو شیپ کرتا آ رہا ہے، اور یٹ پاک افغان، اور ابھی تک مطلب کوئی بھی افغان گورنمنٹ ایکسپٹ Sardar Dawood when he visited Pakistan during, I think so, Ayub regime, he just talked about the Durand line issue, and I think so he made statements also about it that we accept it, but no one can matlab کسی بھی افغان پریزیڈنٹ میں یا کسی بھی افغان لیڈر نے آج تک ڈیورنٹ لائن کو ایکسیپٹ نہیں کیا ہوا ہے. دے کنسیڈر اٹ این الیجیٹمیٹ اینڈ اٹ واز جسٹ ا پیکٹ ود دی برٹش انڈیا ٹو.
اسامہ اس میں پشتونز کا کیا ویو پوائنٹ ہے، جو لوکل کمیونٹی ہے، ناٹ دا جو لیڈرز ہیں ان کا، بٹ جو لوکل افغان ہیں، جو لوکل پشتون ہیں، وہ کیا سمجھتے ہیں کہ کیا وہ بھی ڈیورنٹ لائن کو ڈینائی کرتے ہیں؟ اینڈ as you are part of the Pashtun community, would you like to be part of the same heritage, your same wider culture?
अगर मतलब both sides की पश्तून opinion लिया जाए, especially अफगान citizens का opinion, मेरे काफी दोस्त हैं, उनके साथ मेरा debate होता रहता है इस चीज पे, what do you think about this durand line, or what is your opinion on this? So the answer is clear that yet none of the Afghan has accepted it. They just want the areas under the agreement which was given to the British India of that time. That is all we can say. We can see and can observe in their attitude that they never accepted Durand Line. और इसकी मेन भी मतलब यही है कि मतलब इतनिक, आई सेड दैट इतनिक जो पश्तून इतनिक ग्रुप जो यहाँ इस बेल्ट में है, देयर इज नो डाउट वो हिस्टोरिकली कल्चरली बहुत लिंक है अफगानिस्तान के साथ. सो अफगान सिटीजंस हैव नेवर एक्सेप्टेड द ड्यूरेंट लाइन.
Makes sense. I'll ask a connected question, related question to Sahar. So Sahar, you belong to Afghan Hazara community, which is spread both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So I want to take your personal opinion, like how connected do you feel to the Afghan Hazaras across the border? And, you know, are there some sorts of cultural exchanges between the two? Do you think that the line has been, how has it affected your community overall?
जी बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम.
जी आपकी आवाज आ रही है सर, आप कंटिन्यू करें.
हेलो.
जी आवाज आ रही है आपकी सर, जस्ट कंटिन्यू.
I think sir got disconnected because of internet connection or something. Anyway, I'll ask another question to perhaps Osama. Perhaps you can take that question. It's related to the Taliban's popularity in Afghanistan. So we hear normally from Western media and media in general that Afghanistan एक negative force है, अफगान्स भी सॉरी तालिबान एक नेगेटिव फोर्स हैं और अफगान्स भी जो है वो उन्हें कोई सपोर्ट नहीं करना चाहते और हर कोई उनसे जान छुड़ाना चाहता है एक तरह से. व्हाट्स द ग्राउंड रियलिटी? आई मीन आप वहाँ पे गए हैं, आपने लोगों से मिले हैं, वो आपका इलाका है एक तरह से, तो आप थोड़ा बता सकते हैं कि वहाँ पे किस तरह से सपोर्ट है अफगानिस्तान की में तालिबान की?
I will start from the reports from the Asia Foundation, a department from the United Nations working in Afghanistan. According to the reports that I would like to start from the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan during 1980s. अगर उसी एरिया में देखा जाए तो अफगान जो सिटीजन्स थे, अफगान जो पब्लिक थी, उसकी जो views थी, जो उन लोगों की perspective थी, there is no doubt according to the reports more than half Afghans accepted and supported Taliban. Taliban and sorry, that time Mujahideens. After that in 90s देखा जाए 90s में जब 96 में तालिबान की गवर्नमेंट काबुल में I think so all Afghan people just observed their extreme version of Islam, how they used Islam, a religion, as a tool for their justification and for their legitimacy. और इसी तरह रिपोर्ट्स के मुताबिक अगर एशिया फाउंडेशन रिपोर्ट्स के मुताबिक ड्यूरिंग अशरफ गनी गवर्नमेंट अफगानिस्तान की जो पब्लिक की जो opinion है वो just changed from now just according to the report 13% of the Afghan just support Taliban. I would like to clear one thing here that it is very common in Pakistan also and in Afghanistan also that our people, whether that is Afghanis or Pakistanis, are very easily manipulated by using religion as a tool. So इसी तरह अफगानिस्तान में तालिबान during 90s also used Islam, a religion, as a tool for their justification, for their legitimacy to the power, to the government, to the Kabul, and similarly now also Taliban are using religion for their justification and their to get legitimacy from the Afghan public. But now the scenario is a bit different from the 90s. ابھی کی جو افغان سٹیزنز ہیں ان کی جو پبلک اوپینین ہے, نو ڈاؤٹ اکارڈنگ ٹو دی رپورٹ just 13% of the total population of Afghan support Taliban. Almost more than 97% are against Taliban.
I see. Thank you. Sahir, I think ہمارے ساتھ ہیں ابھی. سہر آپ یہیں پہ ہیں؟
جی
جی, I'll ask you the same question, that as part of Hazara community which is spread over both Afghanistan and Pakistan, how do you think the borderline has affected you and your relatives and your family and everything?
جی تو جو ہزاروں لوگ بیسکلی پرشین ہم یہاں رہتے آ رہے ہیں سالوں سے, اور جو ہمارے ریلیٹیوز ہیں افغانستان میں, دیئر از کلچرل ڈفرینسز بہت زیادہ, بلکہ بہت زیادہ بھی
Sir,
اچھا خاصا.
جی
جی تو اس طرح کے کلچرل ڈفرینسز ہیں اکراس دا بارڈر.
I'm sorry, آپ کی آواز نہیں آئی, کہ ہمیں آپ دوبارہ ریپیٹ کر سکتی ہیں اپنا رسپانس؟
جی میں کہہ رہی تھی کہ نارملی ہم جو پرشین ہیں یہاں پاکستان میں ہم جو آباد ہیں سالوں سے, اور جو ہمارے پرشین لوگ ہیں افغانستان میں, بیسکلی بارڈر لائن کے اکراس جو انوائرمنٹل چینجز ہے, جو پاکستان کا پورا ماحول ہے, جو کچھ ہے سارا, اور جو افغانستان میں, یہ دونوں بہت ڈفرینٹ ہے. تو اس بیس پہ تو جو وہاں پر لوگ رہ رہے ہوں گے, جو یہاں پر ہم رہتے ہیں, تو ہم پہ بھی ان کا امپیکٹ ہو گیا ہے اصل میں ویسے. تو جی کلچرل ڈفرینسز تو ہیں. بیسک چیزیں جو میں کہہ رہی تھی, جو ہمارا ڈریس ہو گیا, ہماری زبان ہوگی, وہ سیم ہے, لیکن کافی چیزیں, مینٹیلٹی, یہ چیزیں ڈفر کرتی ہیں.
Do Hazara people also think that the Durand line should be kind of abolished in a sense, and there should be a greater Afghanistan?
سوری فار دا ڈساپوائنٹمنٹ, لیکن اس چیز کے بارے میں آئی ڈونٹ نو مچ.
میک سینس. روح آپ سے میں سوال کروں گا, جو کہ میں نے اسامہ سے بھی کیا تھا, ریگارڈنگ دی سپورٹ فار دی طالبانس. تو ابھی دیکھا جا رہا ہے کہ اس میں کافی کم سپورٹ ہے طالبان کی, اینڈ کنسیڈرنگ جو ہمیں میڈیا سے بھی ویژولز ملے ہیں کہ لائک دیر ہیو بین اے کپل آف پروٹیسٹ اگینسٹ طالبانس, آلدو وہ ایک کوئی پازیٹیو ان کا آؤٹ کم نہیں تھا. آئی وانٹ ٹو آسک لائک کہ if you can like explain like the resistance that's coming from, where it's coming from, how are people kind of organizing, is there any sort of is it a kind of big thing? Do you think it has some potential, or I mean, can you just articulate the resistance for Taliban in Afghanistan right now?
سب سے پہلے تو آپ کے شکریہ, آپ نے بولنے کا موقع دیا. تو یہ جو ابھی نیوز چینلز اور مختلف میڈیا ویب سائٹس پہ دیکھ رہے ہیں کہ افغانستان میں ابھی جو پروٹیسٹ نکلا ہے طالبان کے خلاف, اس میں سے بنیادی بات یہ ہے کہ what Taliban are claiming is utterly confronting the real situation, the ground realities Afghans are facing. Taliban claim کرتے ہیں کہ they have changed and they are moderated, بٹ دراصل بات یہ ہے کہ ہم میڈیا پہ بھی دیکھتے ہیں, ہمارے پاکستانی کی جو میڈیا ہے, مختلف میڈیا سائٹس ہے, ان پہ دیکھتے ہیں کہ طالبان کے رویے میں بہت چینج آیا ہے. دراصل بات یہ ہے کہ افغان have suffered since last 40 years and 50 years. دنیا کے بین الاقوامی ممالک جو ہیں ان کی مداخلت کی وجہ سے they have suffered a lot. لیکن ابھی جو ایک کرنٹلی یہ انفارچونیٹ انسیڈنٹ ہوا ہے افغانستان میں, 15 اگست کو ایک ٹولہ مسلط کیا گیا ہے افغان کے تاریخی وطن پہ. افغانستان 40 سال سے اپنے ہمسایوں کی وجہ سے اور دنیا کے اور کیپٹلسٹ ملکوں کی وجہ سے ایک بیٹل گراؤنڈ رہا ہے. تو ابھی جو پروٹیسٹ نکلے تھے, they are protesting for their fundamental rights, for their educational rights, for their rights to education, بنیادی چیزوں کے لیے وہ نکلے تھے. اینڈ ابھی جو پروٹیسٹ میں انسیڈنٹس واقعات ہوئے ہیں جو تقریباً 16 افراد کو مارا گیا ہے, وہ اس وجہ سے کہ طالبان برداشت نہیں کر سکتے. افغانستان کا جو قومی پرچم ہے وہ افغانستان کے آئین کے خلاف ہے, افغانستان کے اسٹیٹ کے خلاف ہے. میں طالبان کو, میرا اپنا پرسیپشن یہ ہے کہ طالبان ایک اسٹیک ہولڈرز نہیں ہے. طالبان آر دا پروکسیز آف امریکہ, پاکستان, ایران اینڈ ادر مینی کنٹریز. تو دراصل مسئلہ یہ ہے کہ ہم افغان سمجھتے ہیں کہ انہیں بھی جینے کا کہ رائٹ ٹو ڈیموکریسی, رائٹ ٹو ووٹ, رائٹ ٹو گو ٹو گیٹ ایجوکیشن, بنیادی سہولیات چاہیے. اپنے ملک میں آزادی سے رہنا چاہتے ہیں, مگر دنیا افغانستان کو نہیں چھوڑ رہی. تو میں نے جس سے پہلے کہا کہ افغانستان ایک بیٹل گراؤنڈ رہا ہے اپنے ہمسایوں کا, اور چائنا اور امریکہ. یہ تو بنیادی جنگ چائنا اور امریکہ کا ہے, اکانومک جنگ ہے, سب کو پتہ ہے. افغانستان جو ہے وہ سفر کر رہا ہے. اس کی بنیادی وجہ یہ ہے کہ اپنی جیو پولیٹیکل جو جیوگرافی ہے افغانستان کی, یہ ایک مین فیکٹر ہے جس کی وجہ افغانستان سفر کر رہا ہے. تو ابھی کرنٹلی جو واقعات ہوئے ہیں 19 تاریخ کو افغانستان میں افغان شہری نکل آئے تھے روڈوں پہ اپنا پرچم لیے ہوئے, تو طالبان open fired on them. 16 of Afghans got killed on 19th of August. They were celebrating the Independence Day of Afghanistan. تو بنیادی بات یہ ہے کہ وہ نہیں چاہ رہے کہ کوئی اور مسلط ہو افغانستان پہ. وہ ایک جمہوری حکومت چاہتے ہیں افغانستان میں, لوگوں کا منتخب کیا ہوا حکومت. اشرف غنی افغانستان کے لوگوں کے ووٹ سے آیا ہوا تھا. He was constructing the destroyed state. He was building Afghanistan. تو ایک بہت افغان جو ہے ابھی ایک ڈپریشن کے شکار میں. ابھی جو واقعات ہوئے ہیں, لوگ اپنے گھر سے نہیں نکل رہے, لوگ خوف و ہراس کا شکار ہے. افغانستان میں جو کرنٹ سیناریو ہے, ایک ماتم چھایا ہوا ہے. تو ایک بہت کیا آواز آ رہی؟
جی کنٹینیو.
جی. تو ہم دنیا سے افغان جو مطالبہ کر رہے ہیں کہ ہمارے ملک میں انٹرفیرنس نہ کرے, ہمیں جینے کا حق دے, اور ہمارے داخلی معاملات میں مداخلت نہ کریں.
صحیح. میں اسی میں بس میرے بس 2 کویسچنز ہیں لاسٹ. ایک تو میں پوچھنا چاہوں گا آپ سبھی سے, آپ سے کوئی بھی بتا سکتے ہیں کہ I mean we have seen Afghanistan in war for like past I don't know 40 years now, 40 or more than 40 years Soviet کے بعد. I want to know کہ like 40 years is quite a time. I mean at least ایک generation change ہو جاتی ہے اس ٹائم میں. I want to know کہ like how the war has actually affected you and your relatives and your parents and people who are near to you. اگر آپ تھوڑا بتا سکیں کہ like perhaps some stories, if you can share some stories or so.
جی, افغانستان کے لوگ بہت افیکٹ ہوئے ہیں. 40 سال سے جب سے رشیا آیا ہے افغانستان میں, تو افغانستان کے لوگ کافی سفر ہوئے ہیں. افغانستان کے جو انسٹیٹیوشنز تھے, جو ایک اسٹرکچر تھا, وہ سارا ڈسٹرائے ہو گیا. اور داؤد خان کے ٹائم سے, داؤد خان جو افغانستان کا پریزیڈنٹ تھا, اس کے بعد افغانستان میں حالات کافی انارکی رہی, افراتفری کا شکار رہے. افغانستان جو ہے 40 سال سے 45 سال سے پھر وہ پیسفل لائف اور جو عام زندگی ہے جیسے یورپ, ایشیا اور ویسٹ کے جو ممالک گزار رہے ہیں, اس طرح بالکل نہیں ہے. افغانستان ایک جنگ زدہ ماحول میں ان کا ایک نسل بڑا ہے, تو کافی ڈسٹربنس رہی ہے. ابھی ریفیوجیز بہت چلے گئے افغانستان سے. ابھی پاکستان میں, ایران میں اور ویسٹ ممالک میں افغانستان کے بہت سارے ریفیوجیز ہیں. تو یہ سارے سفر ہوئے. افغانیز have suffered a lot in this war of West and East blocks. تو بنیادی مطالبہ افغانیوں کا بھی یہ ہے کہ بہت ہو گیا 40 سال 45 سال لوگ ہمارے خون بہا رہے اپنے جنگ ہم پہ مسلط کیا ہوا ہے تو they are demanding their fundamental rights and they are demanding to survive to live a life they are wishing a peaceful life a peaceful society.
I'll ask this same question to Sahar also, and with an added like layer of gender, that basically I mean recently there have been reports کہ جو طالبان ہیں انہوں نے زبردستی خواتین کو اپنے نکاح میں لینے کی کوشش کی ہے and even as young as even 12 years or 15 years old women, and also there have been reports کہ کس طرح سے جو کوئی فیمیل افغان فٹ بال پلیئر کی کیپٹن تھیں انہوں نے اپنی ٹیم سے کہا کہ آپ اپنی جو کٹس ہیں وہ جلا دیں کیونکہ یہ ایک طرح سے سیلف سیکیورٹی کے لیے بہت ضروری ہے ان کے لیے. اینڈ سملرلی there have been tons of examples جہاں پہ there have been atrocities on human rights by the Taliban on women and children. تو سحر آپ اس کے بارے میں تھوڑا بتانا چاہیں گے کہ لائک I guess آپ کے کچھ ریلیٹیوز بھی وہاں پہ ہیں, کیسے ایکسپیرینس ہے ان کا, and how are things going and how are you people like trying to cope with all of this happening?
جی سو بیسکلی 15 اگست کو جو کچھ بھی ہوا اس کے بعد سب کو پتہ ہے سوشل میڈیا پہ وائرل ہو گئی ان کی ساری ویڈیو سب کچھ چل رہا ہے. تو اس میں جو ہے ہاں یہ ایک بات آئی تھی کہ انسلیوری لے رہے لڑکیوں کو اور باقی جو عورتیں ہمارے پاس. تو بیسکلی میڈیا میں چونکہ دکھایا تھا تو ہم سب نے تقریباً یقین کر لیا تھا کہ ہاں یہ سچ ہے. تو ہم نے کیا کہ ہم نے ریلیٹیو سے معلوم ان سے پتہ کیا تو انہوں نے کہا ایسا کچھ بھی نہیں ہے, کم از کم جن جن علاقوں میں ہم ہیں اور ہمارے جو لوگ ہیں ان کے ساتھ تو ایسا کچھ نہیں ہوا ہے. اور باقی بھی جو ہم دیکھتے آ رہے میڈیا میں کلم کلا یہ طالبان جو ہے اپنے آپ کو فی الحال تو بہت اچھا دکھا رہے ہیں. ان کی جو فرق جو ہم دیکھ سکتے ہیں بیسکلی ابھی جو طالبان آئے اور جو 90s کی بات کر رہے ہیں تو ایجوکیشن لیول پہ چونکہ ابھی تو آپ کے سامنے یہ طالبان پی ایچ ڈی جنہوں نے پولیٹیکل سائنس میں پی ایچ ڈی کر رکھی ہے اچھا خاصا یہ لوگ تعلیم یافتہ ہو گئے. اور جو ہم نے پوچھا ان سے کہ ہاں واقعی مگر یہ انسلیو کرے لڑکیوں کو اور جو اسکول بند کرے سارا, تو ریلیٹیوز نے خود جواب رہے تھے. انہوں نے کہا کہ ایسا کچھ نہیں ہے, ہماری لڑکیاں یونیورسٹیز بھی جا رہی ہیں اور کیا کہتے ہیں اس کو انسلیوری بھی نہیں ہو رہی. ہاں یہ الگ بات ہے کہ حجاب جو ہے وہ ہمارا وہ مینڈیٹری قرار دیا انہوں نے کہ کم از کم اگر برقع نہ صحیح تو آپ حجاب ٹھیک سے کر لیں. تو اسی جو ہے آپ کا کیا کہتے ہیں اسلامک جو آپ کی اپیئرنس ہے اس کو یقینی بنا کے آپ جو کچھ بھی کرنا چاہیں اپنے جابس کنٹینیو کریں وہ سارا کچھ آپ کریں. یہ الگ بات ہے کہ جتنے بھی جو ہمارے پاس انٹرٹینمنٹ جو بزنس ہے اس کو شٹ ڈاؤن کر دیا اور باقی میوزک وغیرہ اس کو بند کر دیا. اور ساتھ میں جو ویڈیوز وائرل ہوئی تھی جس میں طالبان خود جو ہے وہ نارمل سٹیزن کو ایکسٹرا پیکیج دے رہے تھے کہ اگر آپ کا کوئی چوری ہو گیا کچھ ہو گیا تو آپ جو ہے ہمیں اطلاع دیں, ہم انصاف چونکہ ہم تو لا الہ الا اللہ محمد رسول اللہ ہمارا پرچم یہ کیا ہے تو ہم اسلامی قوانین جو ہے وہ نافذ کر رہے ہیں. تو ایک اور ویڈیو جس میں کسی نے اسٹیتھوسکوپ وغیرہ اور جو سپیگمو مینومیٹر ہے جس سے بلڈ پریشر ہم جو ہے وہ ماپتے ہیں تو وہ کسی نے چوری کیا تھا تو اس کو مار پیٹ پڑی تھی. تو بیسکلی یہ لوگ ابھی میڈیا پہ یہی دکھا رہے کہ ہم بہت اچھے بن گئے سارا کچھ ٹھیک ہو رہا ہے, لیکن ڈیپ ڈاؤن کیا چل رہا ہے پیچھے کیا ہے اور آگے کیا کچھ ہونے والا ہے اس کا تو ہم پریڈکشن نہیں دے سکتے. لیکن ریلیٹیو سے پوچھ کے تو جتنی بھی ہم نے معلومات لی انہوں نے یہی کہا کہ سب کچھ نارمل ہے. انہوں نے یہ نہیں کہا کہ سب کچھ بہتر ہو گیا یا پھر ٹھیک ہے, بس انہوں نے کہا جیسے پہلے تھا ویسے ہی تو نارمل چل رہا ہے سب.
صحیح. I see. To the audience, I'll just say that جو question is answer کا session ہے وہ ہم last میں کریں گے, so just keep your questions with you. ابھی we'll entertain those. I'll end this first part of the discussion with a last question to Ahsan and Osama. Osama, اگر آپ مجھے تھوڑا اس بارے میں بتا سکیں کہ ابھی ریسنٹلی ہم نے افغانستان میں ٹرینڈس دیکھی اور پروٹیسٹ دیکھی جو کہ جن کے ٹرینڈس تھے کہ لائک سینکشن پاکستان, اینڈ دے ہیو بین کوائٹ اپوزیشن ان افغان پیپل اگینسٹ پاکستانیز, while here over this here in Pakistan, ہمیں یہ لگتا ہے کہ شاید ہم ہی وہ لوگ ہیں جنہوں نے افغانستان کی سب سے زیادہ مدد کی ہے, and perhaps we are the ones who have like openly کھلے دل سے invite کیے افغانیوں کو پاکستان میں. So if you can unpack this kind of dilemma, تو that would be really helpful for us.
جی میں
جو بات آپ نے کی, مطلب جو ٹرینڈ چل رہے ہیں جو افغان سٹیزنس کا جو اوپینین ہے ٹورڈ پاکستان اور ٹورڈ دیر پاکستان کی جو مطلب سوشل میڈیا میں جو ٹرینڈ جو ویڈیوز سرکولیٹ کر رہے ہیں یا جو نریٹو پاکستان میں آلریڈی فرام 90s جو بلڈ ہوا ہے, اینڈ یٹ اٹ از the same narrative. اسی طرح افغان کا جو نریٹو ہے since پاکستان 1947 میں جب بنا, اس کے بعد would not go directly. The important question here is that افغانستان کی سٹیزنس کا اس میں مطلب ان کی کیوں وہ اتنے ایگریسو کمنٹس یا گریونیس ان کے اندر ہے یا ان کے اندر ہے فار پاکستان, اور that has we have to analyze it in the ہسٹوریکل کانٹیکسٹ. اسی طرح دیکھا جائے کہ جیسے کہ میں نے ایکسپلین کیا کہ پاکستان ہیز آلویز ٹرائی ٹو انٹرفیئر ان افغان ڈومیسٹک. پاکستان ہیز پلیڈ کی رول سپورٹنگ دی مجاہد جہادسٹ گروپس, طالبان گروپ, the terrorist organizations. اس کی آرگومنٹس پاکستان ہارڈ کنٹری بک میں بھی ملتے ہیں. اسی طرح فورن آتھرز, بہت سی آتھرز اس چیز پہ کمنٹ کرتے ہیں کہ یس پاکستان جو ہے وہ آلویز انٹرفیئر کرتا ہے ان افغانستان ڈومیسٹک پولیٹکس. وہ آلویز ہے a great influence and played a great role in shaping the Afghan's politics. اور اسی طرح دیکھا جائے افغانستان میں جو پرو طالب پاکستان کا جو پرو طالب سٹانس ہے, پاکستان کا جو سپورٹ ہے, جیسے کہ there are many historical speeches of the American Henry Clinton also, and similarly پاکستان میں جیسے کہ میں نے ہارڈ کنٹری کا بک جو ریفرنس دیا ہے, مطلب اس میں بھی اس چیز کا آخر اس چیز کو ایکسپلین کرتے ہیں کہ میں فلاں سے ملا فلاں سے ملا, and he said that it is true that Pakistan support the jihadist group. تو افغان سٹیزنس کا یہ نیریٹو اس وجہ سے I would say it is right because آپ اگر انٹرفیئرنس کرو گے, آپ اگر افغانستان جو افغانستان کی جو پبلک گورنمنٹ ہے جو عوام نے منتخب کی ہوئی ہے, جیسے کہ اشرف غنی کی گورنمنٹ تھی, اس سے پہلے جو بھی گورنمنٹس تھی, مطلب ان کو آپ اوور تھرو کرتے ہو اور آپ ایک ایکسٹریمسٹ گروپس کو, آپ ایک جہادسٹ ایک ٹیررسٹ گروپ کو کابل میں لاتے ہو, اسے سپورٹ کرتے ہو. سو اس لحاظ سے افغانستان کی جو سٹیزنس کی جو نریٹو ہے I would say it is right, and it is okay that show his their hate in social media, in comments or in media. So I would say it is Afghan citizens کا جو narrative ہے that is right about Pakistan because of Pakistan's role in Afghan domestic politics.
ایسے آپ کچھ کہنا چاہیں گے اس کے بارے میں, اور اگر سحر روح اللہ آپ کچھ کہنا چاہیں گے؟
ابھی میری معروف
جی اب آپ کی آواز آ رہی ہے.
معروف میں بتا رہا ہوں کہ آج افغانیوں کا ایک ہی ابھی 40 سال سے وہ لوگ لڑ رہے, 40 سال سے وہ لوگ سفر کر رہے. ابھی افغانستان کا اور افغانیوں کا صرف ایک ہی وہ پالیسی ہے, صرف ایک ہی سلوگان ہے ان کا کہ بھئی ہمیں خود بھی جیو اور ہمیں بھی جینے دو. پاکستان اپنے نیشنل انٹرسٹ کے لیے افغانستان میں انٹرفیئر کر رہا ہے. جو لوگ طالبان سے وہاں تنگ تھے, طالبان نے ابھی میں جو میرا کزن ہے وہ کابل کے میڈیکل کالج میں پڑھ رہا ہے, ابھی آج میری اس سے بات ہو رہی تھی, وہ مجھے بتا رہا تھا کہ بھائی جو ابھی سب سے زیادہ طالبان کے رجیم میں سب سے زیادہ افیکٹ کابل پر پڑا ہے, اور کابل میں جو سب سے بڑا نقصان وہ یہ ہو رہا تھا افغانستان کے جو 20 سال میں جو لوگ تیار ہوئے تھے, جو 20 سال میں جو لوگ ایجوکیٹڈ لوگ افغانستان نے پروڈیوس کیے تھے, وہ ابھی سب افغانستان چھوڑ کے جا رہے ہیں. ایون وہ مجھے بتا رہا تھا کہ بھئی ہمارے میڈیکل کالج کے جتنے بھی ہمارے ڈاکٹرز تھے, جتنے بھی ہمارے پروفیسرز تھے, مور دین 70% وہ افغانستان چھوڑ کے جا رہے ہیں. جو فارن انویسٹمنٹ وہاں پر ہوئی تھی, جو فارن کمپنیز وہاں پر گئے تھے, لوگ گئے تھے, وہ سب افغانستان چھوڑ جا رہے ہیں. تو افغانیوں کو اس چیز کا صحیح سے پتہ ہے کہ جو جہادسٹ گروپ ہے جو جنگ یہاں پر ہو رہا ہے, بھئی اب अभी तो अमेरिका छोड़ के चला गया है। अभी तो मतलब अफगानिस्तान का नाम ही इस्लामी जमहूरिया पाकिस्तान है, इस्लामी जमहूरिया अफगानिस्तान है, और अफगानिस्तान में तालिबान जो है जमहूरियत के खिलाफ है। अभी तो कुछ भी नहीं है। अभी तो मतलब सिर्फ ये मतलब नहीं कि तालिबान मुसलमान है। अफगानियों को इस चीज का पता है कि भाई अब तालिबान को कौन सपोर्ट कर रहा है, और तालिबान जो एक प्रोक्सी है किस मुल्क की प्रोक्सी है। मैं जो भी हमें सुन रहा है और जो भी मारूफ मैं आपको बता रहा हूँ और जो भी हमें इस वक्त सुन रहे हैं, मैं उन लोगों से सिर्फ ये दरख्वास्त करूंगा कि भाई आप लोग ग्राउंड रियलिटीज को देखें, आप मीडिया को ना सुने। जो आपको दिखाई दे रहा है भाई मीडिया पर दिखाई दे रहा है कि भाई पाकिस्तान ने अफगानिस्तान की इतनी मदद की है, वो ये सब झूठ है। अफगानिस्तान 40 साल से सफर कर रहा है, और इसका मतलब अगर आप जाओगे, अगर आप पठानों से पूछो, अगर आप अफगानियों से पूछो, वो पाकिस्तान को ब्लेम करते हैं इस चीज पे। पाकिस्तान ने एक पैसे का उन लोगों को सपोर्ट नहीं दिया। जो लोग यहाँ पर आए हुए पाकिस्तान में उनको सपोर्ट नहीं किया है। सिर्फ हाँ ये बात है भाई वो लोग रह रहे उन लोगों की वजह से। अभी ये बात भी है कि वो लोग उन लोगों को ना रोजगार मिल रहा है, नहीं कोई नौकरी मिल रही है, नहीं वो उनको एड्स मिल रहे हैं। तो बलूचिस्तान में केपीके में हालात खराब हो रहे हैं इस चीज से, अभी और भी खराब होंगे। और देखिए अभी 14 अगस्त में कितने धमाके बलूचिस्तान में हुए, वो मीडिया नहीं बता रहा। अभी जो तालिबान का रिजीम है, अफगानिस्तान में आग लगी है, वो आग की जो शुआ है वो पाकिस्तान में भी आएगी। और पाकिस्तान में भी अगर ये आग लगी तो ये इससे सिर्फ और सिर्फ पठान जो बेल्ट है, हजारा बेल्ट है बलूचिस्तान में, यही इफेक्ट होगा। तो जो अफगानिस्तान की पॉलिसी है, अफगानियों की पॉलिसी है, वो लोग ही कह रहे हैं कि भाई हम लड़ नहीं सकते, हम 40 साल से सफर कर रहे हैं, खुद भी जियो और हमें भी जीने दो। इसीलिए वो पाकिस्तान के खिलाफ है। जो ट्रेंड्स वगैरह चल रहे हैं वो इसी वजह से।
Makes sense, and it was quite an insightful discussion with you all, and I'm really thankful that you have, all of you joined us here. So अगर किसी भी ऑडियंस मेंबर कोई क्वेश्चन है तो वो बेशक चैट में लिखते हैं, या फिर अभी हम लास्ट में Q&A करेंगे तो वहाँ पे आप पूछ सकते हैं. Thank you so much, RoohUllah, Ahsan, Osama, Seher. That was really nice talking to you. We'll move towards the next part of the session, and from here on, Sabha will take the lead. So, yep, Sabha, over to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome, everyone. Thank you so much to our first set of panelists who gave us a very deep insights into the kind of situation that there is currently in Afghanistan. So our second set of panelists include 3 members, very important members who have been studying about Afghanistan in a lot of depth. So the first panelist we have is Dr. Siddiqui, who is a novelist and an academic. He completed his doctorate in history from Oxford University on the topic of Pakistan's relationship with Afghanistan and the impact of Soviet occupation. He has also previously taught at LUMS, and his research interests include revolutionary war and counterinsurgency, war and politics in Afghanistan, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Our second panelist is Mr. Shahabuddin Ahmed, and he is a PhD candidate in political science at the Johns Hopkins University. He's a student of Afghan history, and his research interests include comparative politics and international relations, borderlands, comparative state formation, political violence, and aspects of post-colonialism. Our third panelist is Ms. Ahsan Khan, who is a director, Center for Afghanistan, Middle East, and Africa. Her areas of research include the same regions, like Afghanistan, Middle East, and Africa, and she has a master's degree in democracy, politics, and governance from the University of London. She also has a master's degree in defense and strategic studies from Quaid-e-Azam University, and she's currently pursuing her doctoral degree from Quaid-e-Azam University as well. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I would appreciate if you can turn on your cameras, please. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. How are you all? I hope you're doing well. Right. So yes, so we heard in quite detail about the situation in Afghanistan from the local people over there, from the natives and people who have family over there. But a lot of people, I feel like, don't really have the understanding of who Taliban are, or even if they do, they don't really know where they originated from and where all of this issue began from. So let's start with the origins of Taliban. There's a general understanding that they evolved from the Mujahideen fighting against the Soviet invasion in 1970s. How accurate do you think is this generalization? And if we keep this generalization into mind, then how do you believe that Taliban evolved into a force that we've been seeing today or since the past 20 years? Dr. Siddiqui, you can begin, please.
Broadly, that understanding is correct. The Taliban evolved from certain specific groups of the Mujahideen. In the 1980s, there were a number of different groups, some of which were Islamist oriented, some of which had more, which were drawing from, were led by more Sufi leaders, some of which were more royalist. The Mujahideen, the Taliban were among certain groups that were less focused on the political aspect of what would be the nature of the Islamic State after the fall of the Soviet Union. So they were, generally there were groups, some of the fighters came from groups, the Harkat-e-Inqilab Islami, which was a group led by ulama. So many of the Taliban were demobilized fighters from that group. Some were from the Hizb Islami of Yunus Khalis. In general, many of these fighters had demobilized after the withdrawal of the Soviet Union and only became involved again in the fighting a few years into the government of Burhanuddin Rabbani, when the different Mujahideen factions started fighting amongst each other.
Right, thank you. Mr. Shahab, would you like to add to that, please?
Sure, thank you. I think Ahmed Saab's given a good description. So the first thing to realize is that this war began not in 2001 or with the Soviet intervention. It was a local war. It's always been a local war. It was done to stop the Pashtunistan issue, to stop sort of calls for that when Daud Khan sort of started with that. The initial Mujahideen parties had a plurality, lots of different ideologies. As Ahmed Saab said, there were nationalists, there were royalists, there were Zahir Shah supporters, there were Daud Khan supporters, then there were other parties, Hizb Islami, Jamiat-e-Islami are sort of two of the popular sort of Islamist parties. Then they also differed with respect to their relations to foreign fighters. Some parties had Arabs, others didn't. So a good question to ask relatedly is, how is it that we only remember Hekmatyar and Ahmad Shah Massoud or Burhanuddin Rabbani? The aid that came in from Saudi Arabia, from the US, from channel through Pakistan. Again, this is not me. Brigadier Yusuf's book is written, Brigadier Yusuf's book called The Bear Trap is written about this. Pakistan channeled support to Hekmatyar at the expense of other parties. So Pakistan monopolized who got what. And that led to differences within the Mujahideen, and certain groups and parties became more powerful than others. Most of them ideologically more right-wing, militarily more, as Ahmed Saab said, proficient than in any political aspect. So it was fought as a war, mainly sort of supporting groups like Hizb Islami. Then even when Hekmatyar was the butcher of Kabul, Pakistan still supported him. Then around sort of 93, 94, Pakistan switched sides, and Pakistan, Saudi Arabia switched sides, and the Taliban became the people that we supported. There is also an important difference with respect to the social sort of roots of these two sort of entities. The Islamists, people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Burhanuddin Rabbani, Ahmad Shah Massoud, these are urban Islamists. They went to Kabul University, etc., etc. The Taliban movement, not today, the initial Taliban movement of the 1990s can be called a rural insurrection movement. It was based out of madrasas, not in the countryside, not in urban areas, etc. And Ahmed Shah is also right that the link between the Taliban and the Mujahideen is that when you say Mujahideen parties and leaders, these leaders have various commanders that they recruit all over the place, and then these commanders broke apart and started siding with the Taliban movement as things evolved. So I guess that is the origins of the Taliban.
Right, thank you so much, Mr. Shahab. Ms. Amna, what is your perspective on this? Same question is directed towards you. How do you really think the Taliban's evolved and became a powerful force that they are today? And what's the difference between the kind of Talibans we have today and the kind of Talibans that existed previously?
Okay, well, I think both the previous speakers have given you, the historical background of the group. I'll say this much that, of course, they were members that took part in the former struggle against the Soviet Union. And then, this is a group that is indigenous to the borders of Afghanistan. There's always a linkage with the TTP and whatnot. But for me, this group is solely a Pashtun group that now has other ethnic minorities within the group, but it started off as a Pashtun Deobandi group, and its main aim was again the so-called liberation of Afghanistan. Now, it's very interesting because we keep on hearing this new term of the Taliban 2.0 and whether the group evolved or not. Now, certainly the group's tactics have changed from what they were before, say 2 decades ago. The group, this comes obviously with a fair amount of suspicion, and we have to take it with a pinch of salt to say that the group has totally evolved, but there have been significant changes. For example, I'll start with diplomacy. I think the group has really been engaging in the art of diplomacy, and we've seen this, over the past, I would say, year or so, where the group has actively been engaging with a number of stakeholders. And I find it interesting that the group has engaged with countries like Iran and Russia, countries that obviously the relationship between the Taliban and Iran is known, but then more so with the Soviet Union. And I found it very interesting that for the first time in 2018, and then the follow-up in 2019, the Russians were able to bring the Taliban onto not only the negotiating table with other, Afghan political factions, but do remember it was the first time where the Taliban actually showcased, or rather put their agenda on the table, if we may say. So, the fact that they've been engaging with different countries, remember in the beginning, it was only limited to Pakistan, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Now, more so, we always talk about the peace process, but we seem to forget that it was the Taliban, in fact, that kind of initiated the entire process when they reached out to the American public, the senators, and of course, Trump. And the fact that, they have always been, they've always had an upper hand on the field in Afghanistan. They didn't really need to engage in the peace process, but they did do so. So I think that is a significant shift in itself. Moreover, the statements coming out of the Taliban leadership, it's very positive, and they're saying all the things that the international community in the region wants to hear. Again, as I always say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. We will have to see, how much of this is actually doable and how much they can deliver, because while there might be a change in the leadership, and I'm talking about the Doha leadership sitting in Qatar, at the end of the day, the common soldiers or the fighters, their mindset is still limited. So I think the group might struggle in trying to implement the pledges that they're making when it comes to women's rights, but again, I would say that, the fact that they're talking about these pivotal aspects, such as, a constitution that is inclusive. This is something that the Taliban have never spoken about. The fact that they talk about nationalism, the fact that they have got other ethnic groups within, the leadership, such as Mr. Hanafi. So I think there's a lot of changes that have happened, but again, it comes with a fair amount of suspicion. I will, come back to the main point. And one will have to wait and see. But the group, the fact that, this transition has taken place so far, it has been relatively smooth. We haven't seen, a lot of bloodshed. And also there hasn't been a large exodus of refugees as well. And I think this change in the Taliban, if at all, is not probably because the group wanted to change, but I think because they realized that while Afghanistan has been at war with itself and the international community, Afghanistan has changed, the region has changed. And in order to get that support and recognition, the group so badly needs, not so much from the international community, but I would say from the region, particularly countries, like Iran, Pakistan, China, more importantly, and Russia. The group will not revert to its old ways, because it not only isolated them from the society at large, but also from the region. And therefore, in order to get that support and then naturally legitimacy for a future political setup, I don't think they'll revert to their old ways. But again, we'll have to wait and see, because the group certainly cannot be absolved of the atrocities it committed in the past.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Amna. Mr. Shahab, would you like to add to that, please?
Thank you. I would respectfully disagree with part of the initial analysis. The Taliban are neither Pashtun nationalists, and in fact, they've explicitly targeted tribal elders, Pashtun nationalist political parties in Pakistan, elsewhere. And the history of the Deobandi movement in South Asia is traced back to colonial India from North India. It's not indigenous to Pashtun areas historically. The Deobandi movement started in North India, and it moved here and there. Sana Haroon's work is very good on that. She has that explicated. So I think these are part of the some of the contemporary framings that sort of miss a certain historical depth, either with respect to treating the Taliban as an ethnic entity that just contradicts sort of the fact that they kill Pashtun nationalist political parties, etc. And Pashtun people are the ones that have suffered the most through the Taliban, and also the history of Deobandi Islam in South Asia.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Shahab. Moving on. So my question is for you, Dr. Siddiqui. In this entire process, where do you think the Taliban stand in terms of political legitimacy and illegitimacy? So in terms of different regions within the country or different ethnic groups, and especially on a grassroots level, considering now that they have to establish a government, and we've already seen flag protests taking place in Afghanistan as well this past week. So what do you think, where do the Taliban stand? Are they being considered as politically legitimate or illegitimate on a local level?
So that's not a question with a simple answer. And when you ask that, you have to understand that in the local level in Afghanistan, there are numerous different regions, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic groups. And the reception of the Taliban is going to be very different in those and also within those. There is no real quantifiable way of measuring how much legitimacy the Taliban enjoy. And there have been various surveys about Taliban unpopularity, which are not at all reliable in any way. Generally, these surveys have been carried out by the US and NATO forces. There's obvious response bias. There's obvious regions which were not where Taliban presence was strong, which are not involved in these. So you can't say, oh well, the Taliban have 30% support or 20% support or anything like that. So you can't give that kind of an answer to it. What we do need to understand is that the Taliban cause, however, has enjoyed a huge amount of resonance and indeed legitimacy in Afghanistan. And when I speak of the Taliban cause, I mean of their framing of the narrative as being a war against foreign forces, calling back to the Soviet period occupation, calling back to the British occupation. These are the kind of narratives that they deploy. And what helps them is that they are really the only force that is acting on that narrative in Afghanistan. So whereas Taliban governance is, I think, enjoys less legitimacy, and now again that varies. In certain places, people do welcome them. They do maintain a certain amount of order. In other places, once they've been established for a while, people do resent the level of authoritarian rule. So that is more of a mixed picture. But the basic argument that look, this is a corrupt and illegitimate dispensation, this is an occupation, that has enjoyed wide resonance. And that's not something that is only enjoys resonance in the rural areas. That's something which is the lived experience of many Afghans, even in the Afghan National Army. There are, you see many cases of what is called green on blue violence, where recruits fire on their US and NATO mentors. And there's lots of reasons for that. But there's an excellent book by Antonio Gustosi on the nature of these advisory missions and the kind of tensions that they throw up on the way in which Afghan soldiers have generally seen their mentors as trying to run the show, as behaving in many ways disrespectfully. those kinds of stories, those kinds of narratives percolate not only in Kabul, in other parts of Afghanistan as well. So yeah, you see a cause of removing foreign troops, of which the Taliban is the only group that is actively doing something, and in that sense, they have enjoyed substantial legitimacy, and which is why they have always been able to, despite taking extremely heavy casualties on the battlefield, they have always been able to find sympathy in enough communities and enough recruits, whether it's a majority is not relevant. They've always been able to find enough replacements because that narrative and has credibility as far as enough people are concerned.
Right, thank you. So just a follow-up question for that. What efforts do you believe that the Taliban have been making towards the cause of political legitimacy? Any notable efforts that you have in mind?
So one thing which Amna pointed out earlier is the ethnic outreach. So for example, as early as 2009, they formed the Peshawar Shura of the Taliban formed an exclusively non-Pashtun front called Jundullah in the north of Afghanistan, which was drawing on Tajik and Uzbek and to a lesser extent Hazara fighters, Turkmen as well. This front, was in part, this was a response to the surge of the Obama administration when they put a lot of pressure on the Pashtun heartlands. The Taliban responded by expanding their activities in the north, which is why in the last phase of this conflict, a lot of the cities that you've seen, which were the first to fall, were northern cities, which were not Pashtun majority. So in that sense, their membership, even though their leadership is still Pashtun dominated, as I think would be any national organization in Afghanistan, their membership has diversified substantially.
Right, thank you. So thank you for that great analysis. So like moving on to United States now. So there have been multiple perspectives on both the invasion and the withdrawal, and the general argument is that it was inevitable. However, Biden's administration and Biden himself has been given the blame for a careless and humiliating withdrawal, which is being framed as a foreign policy loss. Considering that the US government itself spent 20 years and about $2 trillion, how do you contextualize these figures and these arguments? Do you think that the withdrawal or certain events could have been unfolded differently? Mr. Shahab and Ms. Amna, please go ahead.
Do you want me to go first?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, of course. I think in retrospect, so much more could have been done. Let me just take you back to say the Doha Agreement. Now, many have criticized the agreement, and rightfully so, but I think it was one of the best ways to at least bring some sort of semblance to Afghanistan. But it's unfortunate that it wasn't implemented in letter and spirit. For example, the day the Americans signed the agreement with the Taliban, it did legitimize the group, which is fine. But then after that, unfortunately, the group did not really fulfill its side of the agreement, whether it came to the ceasefire or intra-Afghan talks leading to some sort of a political settlement. If anything, the Taliban did one thing, and that is that they stopped attacking American forces. And then after that, you had several statements coming out from the previous Trump administration, where they did say, including Mike Pompeo, that the more responsible stakeholder in Afghanistan, particularly regarding the agreement, was the Taliban. And I think that's the mistake that was made. Another mistake was that this entire agreement was signed in the absence of Kabul. So all these aspects emboldened the Taliban. And I think while at the back of our heads, we knew that the Taliban would come into power in one form or another, I think the speed and manner in which this transition process happened and the way the Taliban took over Afghanistan, this was certainly not anticipated. However, this is not something that could have been ruled out. And I think there have been reports coming from Washington and the Pentagon that this was one of the worst case scenarios that was expected or anticipated. But I think it's very clear. It is unfortunate when Biden came into power, he kept on talking about a review of the process. And I don't think anybody expected such a hasty and irresponsible withdrawal from Afghanistan. But I think it's important that now there is still time to salvage the situation. And I do put the onus on the Americans more so because they are, a principal signatory to the agreement, and they have a responsibility. And I think it's essential now that, they do push towards, or they broker some sort of a, inclusive political setup we keep on hearing about. The Taliban are open to it. They've been engaging with the major political factions in Afghanistan and political figures such as Dr. Abdullah, Hamid Karzai, and of course Hikmatyar, but others as well, particularly former members of the Northern Alliance that were here in Islamabad as well. So I think it's important now that instead of shifting the blame, because usually the blame comes to Pakistan, which is always a convenient scapegoat, and there might be some truth to it because of our previous role in Afghanistan. But I think it's important now that it's focused on shared and collective responsibility. It is essential now, because at the end of the day, it's the region that is going to have to face the repercussions, and we've already seen that in the 80s, and I don't think any regional country can afford for history to repeat itself. Just one more point, and I think it's important. In my view, I think there is some sort of a regional consensus now, particularly regarding Afghanistan's immediate neighbors, which is of course Pakistan, Iran, the Central Asians, the Russians, and more importantly, China, where they appear to be on the same page, where obviously they're focusing on a political settlement and also the recognition of the Taliban, as well as, to fight transnational terrorist groups. So I think there's regional recognition and there's regional consensus. But again, here the important question is, which country could play the role of that credible interlocutor? Because, there's so much historical baggage of all the countries. The only viable country, I think, would be China to play that role. It has a great relationship with all the political factions in Afghanistan, including the Taliban. But it remains to be seen whether it will, increase its role, particularly when it comes to making all sides deliver. That has to be seen.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Amna. Mr. Shahab, please, would you like to go next?
I'm sorry. Could you repeat part of your question? I missed part of it.
Right. So my question was about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. I wanted to ask whether you feel like the events could have unfolded differently, and Biden and his administration could have taken certain measures to ensure that the entire situation wouldn't be as chaotic as it turned out to be.
Okay. To answer that, I think that US policy has been very contradictory over the years, NATO policy in Afghanistan. The peace talks, or the initial idea about the peace talks, according to Ahmed Rashid's work, sort of dates back to 2008. They started sort of talking to certain Taliban leaders. It can go back even further. The Taliban, once they were dislodged, made the initial move towards reconciliation. They were thwarted back then by the Bush administration early on. But it's been a contradictory policy, and it's been and the more you look into the details of how international aid and the money that went into Afghanistan was used through the contractor system, it is horribly mismanaged, is the sort of gist of it. So to be very specific, with two examples, one is that if the NATO forces or the NATO, there was some consensus about wanting to negotiate with the Taliban as early as 2008 or later. Up till about 2014-13, the US and NATO were pursuing a policy of leadership decapitation and fragmenting the Taliban, getting some people on board, which is entirely contradictory to an eventual peace deal with the entire movement, right? You can't fragment people and create internal divisions and then try to solve violence and stop it. So that's been a contradictory. Second is that the amount of money and the way money has been spent by especially foreign contractors in Afghanistan has been done without any accountability, with very little accountability. The Afghan government is not allowed to audit foreign contractors. A firm based in Minnesota is supposed to have the cultural, technical knowledge to build a road in southern Afghanistan. So it's created jobs in the pipeline. All of the money that came in, part of it went back through wages paid to INGO workers and to foreign contractors. And it's been horribly mismanaged. So, I mean, there is no, I don't think that by the time President Biden came to office, anything could have been done differently.
Right, thank you so much. Dr. Siddiqui, do you believe that do you agree with the arguments that were presented here, and do you believe that nothing differently could have been done, or do you have a different perspective to present?
Yeah, I think broadly, I agree with both of the positions that were described. I mean, like what could have the only thing that really could have been done differently at this point was in terms of just the extent of chaos, which would have required the US visa system, for example, to have got its act together. It would have required more, earlier evacuations. In actuality, it would have what that would have done, though, it would have even given quite an obvious signal that everyone was expecting that the Taliban would win. So in reality, in terms of like the scenes of chaos that you're seeing at Kabul airport, the only way those really could have been resolved is if the US had in fact admitted, okay, the Afghan government is not going to be able to stand up to a Taliban advance, and had actually negotiated a transfer of power with the Taliban, because that was at this point the only option left. Now that was not going to happen simply because the US was not going to suddenly admit defeat in a war. I mean, even now, the Biden administration has been at pains to claim that this hasn't been a defeat because we were actually never really fighting this war. So and that change was not going to happen. So yes, so in terms of the tactical mismanagement, yeah, it could have been different. It wouldn't have been. In terms of they could have stayed on a bit longer. That's we have to remember that the bulk of the US forces withdrew in 2014. The maximum of 15,000 troops that have been left in the last 7 years. We're never going to change the dynamic of the war. We're never going to create a new create new pressure on the Taliban. Their presence was really was primarily about providing air support and training. You've had 7 years of that. I don't see how another year would have made a difference.
Right. Thank you so much. So adding on to that, if we compare the previous Afghan government that was backed by the US and any governance by the Taliban, how would they weigh against each other, especially from a civilian or a popular support perspective and a humanitarian perspective as well? Clearly, civilians are terrified and the withdrawal has triggered what is being called a mass exodus, as we can see from the Kabul airport as well. So what does the future of Afghanistan look like in terms of human rights? Ms. Samna, go ahead.
Sorry, could you repeat it? I lost you in between.
Right. So the question was that if we compare the previous Afghan government that was being backed by the US and any governance of Taliban, how would you weigh them against each other? And especially from a humanitarian perspective, we can see that civilians are very, terrified, and which has triggered a mass exodus. So what do you believe the future of Afghanistan looks like in terms of human rights?
Right. Well, I think, you can't really compare, the US-backed government, the successive governments, whether it was Hamid Karzai's or for that matter, President Ghani's, or the government of national unity, which was certainly not unified to the Taliban. I think one has to look, into the future. And I think we need to be cautiously optimistic. Afghanistan has been at war with itself and the international community for far too long. And, people have suffered. I think there is a realization, particularly within the region, that, you cannot have one country in turmoil and not expect, the repercussions of that to transgress into, the other border countries. And I think the regional countries have realized that. Therefore, I think we see more regional ownership, and that ownership is towards having a stable and peaceful Afghanistan. Now, this might sound cliche, but I think it's important to have a stable and peaceful Afghanistan for all the regional countries and not just for Pakistan. So, as long as I think there is, international support for whichever political dispensation comes into Afghanistan, and one hopes that it is an inclusive one, we're seeing this, and again, as I said, I hope something comes out that is inclusive and representative of all. It might not be perfect, but we just need a workable structure that can begin to deliver. I think it's workable. I think, again, as I said, the regional countries realize that they cannot afford more turmoil in Afghanistan, and certainly not a repeat of what has happened over the past 2 decades. Therefore, I think they also have their stakes in having some sort of semblance in Afghanistan, which again comes back to having this inclusive setup, because I think there is no other way. The Taliban also know it, that they cannot rule in totality, and that, they cannot operate in isolation as well. And that is why we've seen the Taliban engage with these major Afghan political stakeholders, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, in Moscow. And these talks have been going on in private. And hence you see that when President Ghani left the country, Dr. Abdullah stayed, and he has been in touch with the major top leadership of the Taliban, particularly within Afghanistan. So regarding human rights and whatnot, I think one is just going to have to wait and see how things work out. For now, I think it's important that first somewhat of a government is formed, an inclusive one. And then I think, one will have to see whether this government is going to get recognition from the international community or not, because there are a number of questions on whether there will be sanctions and recognition. But I think, as I said, for now, it is important that all major stakeholders remain engaged with and in Afghanistan, and that there is push for this inclusive political setup, without which I think, we will continue to see Afghanistan remain in turmoil. My apologies, I have to leave because I have another commitment at 9 o'clock. So I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to cut it short here. But thank you for having me.
It's all right. Thank you so much for being here with us, Ms. Amna. It was very nice to have you on board. Right. So with that, I will move on to you, Mr. Shahab. What is your take on this humanitarian crisis?
I think the Afghan students that spoke earlier covered it very well. The humanitarian consequences are becoming evident as if you follow social media. It's a good point to be made that please do not follow mainstream news. You don't really hear or never really have heard what is sort of going on. But I think I agree with Amina's point about that there is a regional consensus about recognizing Taliban, about sort of trying to work with Taliban, etc. But the regional consensus, you need to understand, is predicated on the satiation, on the satisfaction of very particular interests, right? So as long as certain economic interests are satisfied, as long as CPEC is okay, as long as Chinese expansion sort of is okay, as long as Iran, etc., gets trade routes, etc., all of that will lead to the recognition of whoever is in power in Afghanistan. And the gist of that is that the priority is order, right? Security order for economic sort of, ties, etc., over any kind of justice. It doesn't matter what human rights, etc., are being sort of presented, and that's kind of the way sort of Russia, China. Not that the US is any better, but sort of, it is an idea that sort of order will take preference from here on in over any kind of social justice or justice as sort of recognized by that. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. So, Dr. Siddiqui, what would you like to say about this?
I mean, I think one additional aspect I think I would just like to add here, and I think, to some extent, again, it's a question of we are going to have to wait and see, because I think you can see matters developing in neither a negative or positive direction, as the other participants pointed out. But I think in one other additional aspect to point out here is that we are going to see a huge shrinking of the Afghan state, which has for the last 20 years been hugely foreign aid sponsored, foreign aid funded. The last, I think, figures that I have are for 2019, when 80% of the budget was coming from again from foreign aid. That's to say nothing of the army, which was never designed to be sustainable. It was the size that was being aimed for was 300 to 500,000 people. This is in a country of 25 million. Now, of 30 million. Now, if you look at the contrast with Pakistan, which is considered to be very militarized, we have an army of on twice the size in a population about 9 times the size. So that is not an army that the Afghan state was ever going to be able to sustain. Much of that has, in fact, naturally shrunk through desertions, through ghost salaries and the like. So that is one aspect, again, where I think the army is going to part of that is going to naturally deteriorate. But in terms of the state as well, like all the development projects, all the funding, all of that has been very, very dependent on foreign aid. So we, going ahead, I don't see that level of foreign funding coming into Afghanistan. and that is going to lead to an economic crisis. So there's going to be a huge shrinking of the Afghan state, and if there is additional talk of, and that is one thing that I do think that the Taliban government is beginning to be aware of, or and if it, and will become aware of, that they will have to play by certain rules. Now, where the rules are, what the rules are, will depend on where the funding is coming from. As Shahab said, if it's more of a if they're more dependent on regional funding from Russia, China, so forth, the focus will be more on order, and the focus will be on, again, anti-terrorism cannot be a safe haven. If the US stays engaged, they will have some leverage to push on. Again, I do agree again with Shahab that that a lot of these concerns of human rights are used in specific ways, but if they continue to be used in that way, they will have certain leverage on those aspects. So again, it really does depend on what the nature of the economic crisis is, and how much flexibility the Taliban will show in that context.
Right, thank you. So just adding on to that, China and Russia are rushing to provide aid to the Afghan state now. So can't it be argued that the dependency on foreign aid is constant, however, the source is just changing?
The quantity is different. So how much they would be willing to give to a Taliban dispensation in Afghanistan depends a lot. So I think regardless of, and I do expect aid to be coming in, but I think there are still going to be major economic changes.
Right, thank you so much. So my next question is to you, Mr. Shahab. As we can see, there's this narrative where many Pakistanis see the fall of Kabul as a war won against imperialism, because they're cheering on the Taliban, who they believe have supposedly defeated the US Army. So although this narrative is very similar to the one highlighted previously, in which Taliban had defeated a superpower, which was the Soviet Union, do you believe that this distinction exists, is it really Taliban versus the US, or do you see Taliban as a product of imperialism and not something that is created against it?
That's a really difficult question, but thank you for asking. It's an important question. I don't see the Taliban as anti-imperial the way they are being sort of celebrated entirely, because there are various contradictions with respect to that. And if you've used the word imperial, then I guess I should frame the discussion also in terms of how the West is right now looking at the situation, which is that there is the West was the imperialist, and then there is this anti-imperial resistance, which is the Taliban. How do we conceptualize that? It is either Islamist or it is ethnic, because those are the two things we see when we look at the area. And right now, the debate in the West is about ethnic. It is Pashtun nationalists, etc. And as I said previously, the Taliban movement is very distinct from Afghanistan's past. It has targeted Pashtun nationalist parties. It has targeted tribal elders. It has targeted, to put it very briefly, alternative sources of what you can call native authority, which makes the anti-imperial bit a little complicated in that respect. And that is not to sort of suggest in any way that sort of the sort of imperialism that has sort of not caused this. That is also true. As far back as you can go, it is sort of the way Afghanistan has been placed within either the Soviet or sort of the NATO, European, US sort of countries' interests, and in the interests literally of client states or friends of imperial powers like Pakistan and sort of other regional powers, Saudi Arabia, etc. It has been sort of used in that manner. So what side, who is the imperialist, where does it begin is also an interesting question. So yeah, it's a complicated question, but I think there is a lot of debate from the Pakistani left right now, and that this is not anti-imperialism. That is a very good sort of line to be pursuing. I think there are very valid arguments to be made there.
Right, thank you so much. Dr. Siddiqui, what are your views on it? Do you see it as a project of imperialism, or do you see something which was created against imperialism?
Look, I mean, I broadly agree with Shahab. I mean, I think you can say that it is also both, right? Like, it's a movement that that did, again, now if we want to go a really long time back, to the British Empire, there was all kinds of indigenous resistance to British involvement, and is both on both sides of the Durand line. There were Pashtun tribal groupings were involved in what was then called the Great Game. Now, you move that along when Pakistan becomes independent. There's this conflict over the Durand Line, which was obviously a border which was at that time had been enforced by a British imperial power at that time, which started off Pakistan and Afghanistan on antagonistic terms. Now, for the next 30 years, that antagonism stayed within certain bounds because at that point it hadn't really become a center of Cold War conflict. But for the first 30 years, the relations were not good. At that point, for those first 30 years, the primary interference or the primary across the border was from the Afghan side to Pakistan. It was because the Afghan rulers in Kabul had always maintained their ties with Pashtun tribes in Fatah, which were again, which was quite natural. And so the Afghan government kind of wanted at least an acknowledgement of the fact that these were the same people, or it was never super clear whether they wanted a change of border or whether they simply wanted to ensure rights of Pashtuns. These demands changed over the course of the next 30 years. Pakistan's position was basically sort of a status position, which was that this is the frontier, and that's that we're left with, and that's what we have to deal with. And so these relations continued. Sometimes they were more positive, sometimes they were not, but they stayed within certain bounds, and that was mostly Afghanistan interfering across the border in Pakistan, Pakistan shutting down transit trade for Afghanistan when things got too heated. In the 1970s, there was talk even earlier, as early back as the 50s, about Pakistan also cultivating groups in Afghanistan the same way that the Afghan state was doing in Pakistan. There was talk about that as early as the 1950s. It had manifested, as Shahab pointed out, in the early 1970s, which is when the Afghan Islamists who had tried to carry out a failed uprising against the Daud regime were given support by Pakistan. But that uprising, which was supported by Pakistan, at that point was still only intended as a negotiating chip. It was intended to get Daud to the negotiating table, which it did. And for the next 5 years, as negotiations with Sardar Daud progressed, the Islamists were effectively in cold storage. The Pakistan state still kept them on its side of the border, but was no longer supporting them. This changes again when you have imperialism coming in new guise, which is that of the Soviet takeover. Well, first the communist coup in Kabul, followed by the Soviet invasion. Now that the communist coup in itself did not immediately result in a huge amount of resistance, because there was still a sense of this is Badshah Gardi in Kabul. In much of rural Afghanistan, it was still not seen, okay, this is another group of the ruling elite in Kabul and doesn't really concern us. That changed when the communists tried to implement what they considered reforms, but was really a kind of a repressive attempt at seizing power over the countryside in a very violent way. That's when resistance started to them. That's when these Islamists who had were from the same university as the communists, had known them in the 70s, were the first to warn against them. That's when they started gaining more support as being the first ones to warn about the dangers of a communist rule. So that's when they started gaining support. That's when you had more and more refugees coming across the border in Pakistan. And so that resistance started quite indigenously. If Pakistan had not been involved, there would still have been a resistance in Afghanistan throughout. In my mind, there's no question about that. And in the first 2 years, 79 to 82, after the Soviet invasion, Pakistan, the amount of support Pakistan was given was very, very limited. That increased during the Reagan administration. So where it now became more of a thing of and especially from 85 onwards, the supplies and the funding really increased to the point that it became the best funded insurgency in the world. So it was anti-imperial, yes, but it was also being funded by an imperial power as well. Again, fast forward to the end of the Soviet occupation, where we had a very similar situation to what we've had here, where there was no serious attempt to work out what the nature of a future Afghan dispensation should be. The focus of the negotiations throughout was on Soviet withdrawal versus end of non-interference. So those were the official negotiations that happened in Geneva. And finally, when the Soviets did agree to withdraw at the end of that period, everyone was scrambling. Oh, but what is going to happen now in Afghanistan? What is going to be the nature of the dispensation? In that situation, it resulted in a civil war, effectively. The communist regime the Mujahideen were a lot more fragmented at that point than the Taliban are today. The communist regime proved a lot more resilient against their fragmentation. There was a failed siege of Jalalabad, which gave extra strength to the communist regime. And so after that, the communists, while they were still there, were increasingly, the Soviet troops had left. So it became much more of a civil war, even though different groups had, obviously their foreign connections. But it was now primarily a war of Afghans on Afghans, and people grew increasingly disillusioned with that. That's when a lot of fighters demobilized effectively, because they were like, okay, what's the point of now killing more Afghans? The foreign troops are not even here. So that's the kind of anarchy in which the Taliban emerged. And again, the Taliban emerged originally, again, with, these are people who have very little knowledge of Afghan society. Many of them have basically just spent their lives in the madrasas or were demobilized fighters. And they are like, okay, this is complete chaos. Now the Mujahideen are now acting as warlords. We need to restore some sort of order and justice. And so this is the sort of idealism which they come in with initially, is kind of just restoring that. Initially, they are welcomed, especially in the Durrani Pashtun heartland, as being a force that can kind of restore order and allow commerce to flourish. After that, they prove themselves completely incapable of understanding the nature of Afghan society, of trying to impose their own understandings on very vastly different regions, and they become extremely resented to the extent that when after 9/11, the US invades Afghanistan, the Taliban collapsed with barely any resistance, because at this point, no one really is bothered enough, whether or not they're keen on the US bombing, that no one really is bothered enough to defend them at this point. So they collapsed very, very quickly. It was only because thereafter there was no attempt made to integrate them. In fact, instead they were being hunted down. Instead, they were being sent to Guantanamo. Instead, they were being excluded from society. And not just them, but anyone who may be associated with them or may have a dispute with the ruling dispensation, or may just be like a case of misidentification. That then started, and this new US presence, which now supposedly was just there to remove the Taliban, it stays and stays and stays for years, and creates its own resentments and creates its own grievances. And yes, it becomes an imperial occupation effectively. And that is the story then that the Taliban, as they start to regroup, find has resonance. And so yes, I do think in some sense they are, they are a product of imperialism, but and also were anti-imperial, have been anti-imperial in their fight in the last 20 years, because there was also an imperial occupation of Afghanistan. So I think both of those things can be true.
Right, thank you so much. Having said all of that, we should move on to Pakistan now. My question is for you, Mr. Shahab. There have been so many fears regarding the spillover effect into Pakistan with regards to the emergence of religious extremism due to the existence of entities like TTP. Apart from these fears, do you also believe that Taliban governance in Afghanistan will have a direct adverse impact on Pakistan, considering Pakistan's role against the Taliban? And should a state like Pakistan be as optimistic as it appears to be right now, keeping in mind how Pakistan handed over several Talibans, including Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, to the US? And what does Pakistan's future look like now?
Thank you. That's another very good question. So it is true to say that there are segments of the Afghan Taliban movement that have not as good relations with the Pakistanis as other segments of the Afghan Taliban do. Right. We have also, I mean, I'm being like stating sort of things as they are. Pakistan has also arrested, intimidated, used, coerced various Taliban leadership into sort of doing things also. Yes, there are other factions that are completely on board, including sort of the Quaid-e-Azam and the Afghans that made a part of the Quaid-e-Azam to around 2015, etc. So that is sort of one aspect to it. The trend that seems to appear is that there is an effort when you have such a big insurgency that has been going on, sort of a war economy for the past half a century. It is very difficult to institutionalize and get everyone on board into a single coherent group like Taliban. You need a strong external backer, someone who can set things right, someone who can sort of intimidate courts, people who are falling apart, and who that is, I think we know. So there has been that effort to institutionalize the insurgency better and get it to listen to one central sort of line of chain of command, etc. So that is happening. As far as consequences for Pakistan go, that is also a complicated question. I guess the only thing I will say about that is that you should, when you think about the Afghan Taliban, the TTP, other groups, about human rights, for example, we tend to isolate these issues, right? So you might be able to put a ring around the Taliban, or the Afghan Taliban, and say operationally, strategically, this is where it begins and this is where it ends. Sure. But this is, but things are a little more complicated than that, right? So, I mean, networks and sort of, there are networks of material interests, of tangibles, of the war economy that have to now sort of remain a part of this situation, have always been. Then there are also, more importantly, networks of ideas, right? So if you can tell me the difference between the view that the Chief Justice of the Taliban would have about women's rights or bodies or lives, and what a right-wing cleric in Pakistan that argues with Order of March would have, then sure, there is something to be said there. But I don't see what the difference is. I also don't see now, again, human rights and stuff. Madrasas are no longer dictated by push or pull factors of the economy. The madrasas in Afghanistan are the only game in town now, right? So the schooling, you tell me the difference between a Taliban school and a madrasa, again, you win. So it's not economic push or pull factors or whatever else you say anymore. So I'm a little less optimistic about sort of whatever can be salvaged out of the Taliban to moderate, to make them more moderate, etc. I'm a little less optimistic about that, because then you can say, okay, something like madrasa with modern education. But I mean, yeah, right? So it is difficult to sort of point to what those differences are. Please remember, things cannot be put into containers, into strict borders. These are networks of material, tangibles, and networks of ideas. And that is where there will be problems. Yeah.
Right, thank you so much. Dr. Siddiqui, what are your views on this?
So I think, I think that was an excellent answer. So I'm not going to go into it in any particular detail. So I broadly agree with what Shahab was saying. So I think the one thing in the question that I would slightly take issue with was I don't think the Pakistani state has been super optimistic about this outcome, and I think that has shown in the kind of scrambled responses to the situation as it was unraveling over the summer. I do think, while maintaining that the ties with the Taliban those have not been cut off by any stretch of the imagination. I do believe that the state has been shifting to in a direction where they had wanted Taliban plus, right? So it's, you have the Taliban, but you also have Dr. Abdullah. You also have the different figures from the Peace Council. They you want kind of a stable dispensation where any neighboring state is not just going to now support its proxies as happened in the 90s. So I think that shift has been happening in the Pakistani state's position over the last few years. So this, so when the Taliban's onslaught in the summer was so successful, I think there was that is why you received, you heard somewhat more panicked responses, because I think at this point the state's preference is Taliban plus others dispensation in Kabul would be at number one. Worst outcome is a civil war. In between that, they would take a solely Taliban administration if they think it could preserve the peace, but they don't really think it can. So so that's why, again, there is still some pressure happening. That's why, the likes of Karzai and Abdullah and so on are still there in Kabul. There is pressure on the Taliban, not to carry out reprisal killings, not to, to try to include as many of these people as they can. So how successful ultimately that will happen, and that will be, remains to be seen. Now, as Shahab was saying, it is, there's while being it's not a unitary organization. It's, while not being fragmented, there are different centers of power. You may see in the days going forward, I think you may see very different, a very mixed picture emerging. You will see some reports of atrocities coming. You will see some reports of, the Taliban are saying to Shias, please go ahead and and go to your mosques. We'll provide security. You're going to see this kind of mixed picture, which has already been emerging, continue to emerge. In different parts of the country, you might find very different styles of Taliban governance. So probably, again, so probably, I don't know if this is the direction things are going to take. Probably the most optimistic construction that you could put on it is if it is governed in a relatively decentralized way. Now, that is not going to mean that, so where the Taliban basically are like, okay, this is Kabul culture, and we are going to deal with this in a certain way, and this is the culture in this place. Where there's a bit less imposition. Now, that is not necessarily going to mean that, for example, in terms of women's rights, that you will get women uniform women's rights. So decentralized can be, so in areas where the culture is much more conservative, you might see more pushback. So it's decentralization itself is not necessarily going to be amazing on all of the rights issues either. But that it might still be better in as opposed to the Taliban attempt to enforce their particular understandings on all regions of Afghanistan, which will again then lead to more resentments and eventually would not be sustainable.
Right. Thank you so much for this. I believe we've summed up everything really well. We touched upon the situation of Afghanistan, the imperialism, and then Pakistan's role in this as well. So to sum it all up, and at the end, and I just have this broad question for you both. With regards to mainstream narratives and imperialist narratives, as well as general historiography, what kind of questions should we be asking right now? If the discourse around Afghanistan is to be framed, what should that look like? Mr. Shahab, you can go.
Dr. Ahmed, would you like to take a stab at that first? So, I mean, one thing, I guess, if your question is specifically about discourse, I would say two things. One, echoing the Afghan students that spoke earlier, which is that it's very difficult to trust the media. I used to work on FATA, on local politics. If we dig up archives of newspapers, after 2013, there is a complete blackout. Before that, you used to hear at least, XYZ person, this in Zaka Khel area, this happened in Kuram, that sort of, they did this. After 2013, 14, all names are gone, all names of areas are gone. It is just ISPR news, at least for FATA. Afghanistan is a whole different ballgame, especially when you talk Pakistani media. So be very careful about what we are told. What we are told, point number two, and final point on this discourse thing is that please don't think in like binaries. That is going to become the norm. Us versus them. Pakistan, Afghanistan, containers separate. Afghan Taliban, TTP separate. Pashtuns are sort of separate from those, etc. It's going to be containerized into these binaries, and that is going to be the discourse. So it's good to sort of be careful of that. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much. Dr. Siddiqui, would you like to add in? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the framing really does depend on what your audience is, right? I feel like, again, with with an audience of Pakistani students, we should be aware and able to highlight, as Shahab has been doing here, the role that Pakistan state has been playing, the role of the role that it's not simply a thing of Pakistan is a victim in this war. Pakistan I mean, that can be true, but it can also be true that Pakistan is also is also a perpetrator. Now, so in a Pakistani audience, I think again, so when framing this for a Pakistani audience, that is something to keep in mind. If you're framing the frame that we're using, again, when we're discussing with a US audience, I would use a very different frame because I think there's a tendency to just sweep everything under the rug, and if only Pakistan hadn't supported the Taliban, everything would have been hunky-dory. And now that is again a framing that is very convenient for a US audience and basically false. And so so there you have to kind of understand that in an insurgency, it's not enough simply to have an external sponsor. You need to have a certain amount of legitimacy in the country. You need to, in order to be able to be viable, because just because of the extreme military asymmetry, an insurgent movement that doesn't have local support is not viable. And that's kind of the framing that, to some extent, U.S. counterinsurgency planners do understand. But although they have still a very militarized understanding of it, but in broad US discourse is not understood at all. So that framing, I think, is important. Again, the ways in which these wars are justified, for example, that is a framing to keep in mind. Again, when the ways in which women's rights, for example, are used and become of great interest, specifically only at times when it justifies going to war, and specifically only against adversaries. So this is the use of women's rights as a justification for war in Afghanistan is not by any means unique. It's been used. I mean, if you look at the U.S. Positions on Iran versus Saudi Arabia, how in Saudi Arabia, where by any, I think, objective measurement, women enjoy significantly less rights than in Iran. But that does not get highlighted. If it does, it'll be mentioned on the side. It doesn't influence relations, but it becomes a good reason for imposing sanctions on Iran. It becomes a good reason for demonizing Iran in the public opinion space. So this is an aspect, and this is something that goes back a long way. Like if I'm sure like a lot of students would have read Edward Said's Orientalism and the ways in which the colonial discourse uses that. I mean, that's something you can understand just simply by following the media yourself, that certain issues become more important when they're serving certain ends. That you can see for yourself, even if you haven't read that. So yeah, I think the framing you can't use like a single frame, and much less, as Shah was saying, a binary frame. It really depends on who you're addressing and what you're addressing.
Right, thank you so much for this. Mr. Shahab, you would like to add something to this?
I think I agree with everything Amitabh just said. These are all very important points. I think Sahir made some very good points about women's rights. It's not entirely my space to speak, but Amina has also left. There is just one thought that I would leave, especially since we have students here. The thought is that, these days, as Amitabh pointed out, there is a lot of rhetoric from the West about women's rights, and often George W. Bush and Tony Blair are quoted as sort of having done this war to protect women and children. And as I pointed out to Amitabh during our private discussions also, the Mullah Omar and Bin Laden also have recorded speeches saying that we are fighting for our women and children. And the thought is that, ironically, in modern wars, what we call civil wars in our region, in Africa, in the Middle East, the biggest victims of these wars fought by men for women and children are women and children. Because women and children, this category we use, civilian casualties, they are overpopulated in there. They're overrepresented in this category. And violence means displacement, loss of economic violence, other sorts of violence also. So that is just a thought to remember, that wars are usually justified in that rhetoric. And Amitabh is absolutely right, especially in Oriental terms as well.
Right, thank you so much. So that's it for the discussion today. Thank you so much for being here with us, Dr. Siddiqui and Mr. Shahab. It was absolutely delightful and a pleasure to talk with you. And I'm sure everyone who joined the conversation as well, and everyone who was here in the session, they have certainly got to learn a lot from you, especially from a perspective that is different from the mainstream, a narrative that Pakistani media is producing, and a narrative that is being projected very irresponsibly on other social media platforms as well. So thank you so much once again for being with us. And if anyone has any questions, then please type it in the chat. Otherwise, we're a little short in time. Yes, please go ahead. I think someone has a question, just a second.
Yes, am I audible?
Yes, yes, you are.
Yes, so basically recently I was reading opinion piece by Thomas Friedman in New York Times, and he mentioned a very interesting thing regarding the whole Afghan situation. He said that there's एक कहावत है अफगानियों में कि मैं और मेरा भाई मेरे कज़न के खिलाफ और मैं मेरा भाई और मेरा कज़न बाहर वालों के खिलाफ. So what he was trying to say कि like Afghans and Talibans आप जितना मर्जी उन्हें कंट्रास्ट करने की कोशिश करें, they will stay united against an outsider which is the US. So he was implying that once the outsider is out, now there is a possibility that जो अफगान हैं वो तालिबान के साथ डील करेंगे. I mean, they will now sort out a situation where they will kind of move towards a more democratic or Afghan government. वो शायद तालिबान को निकाल के हो या उनके इंक्लूसिव हो, जैसे भी हो. Do you think that's happening? Anyone can take that question.
So to a certain extent, but I don't. So I don't think there's any chance actually that Taliban and then that the Taliban would be removed now. They are basically in power. You can have there is some possibility of a negotiation with Hamid Karzai की basically ऐसे ही कहावत रही है ना. He was I think he was pilloried quite a lot some years ago when he was at a funeral, when he was calling on the saying that the Taliban were his brothers and that they needed to work together. Hamid Karzai is from the same he's also Durrani Pashtun. He's from in the late 90s, he almost became the Taliban ambassador to the UN. I don't know if you know that. So yes, so there is kuch len den to hai. I think there is some possibility there, but I think the ball is really in the Taliban's court right now, because they have now all of the main. I mean, they're the only group with military power. So if they are willing to be flexible, I think they can find space for rapprochement. I don't think that is going to result in exactly a democratic government per se, but it may result in taking more of these people's concerns into account. Mullah Baradar, who is now in Kabul as part of the negotiations, he's again someone who, when he was leading the Taliban before his capture by Pakistani forces, he was again someone who was trying to who was known as a consensus builder within the Taliban, who was keeping different factions from fighting each other. So there is some potential in that sense, but it's going to be Taliban dominated. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Right. Thank you so much for this, Dr. Siddiqui and Mr. Shahab. It was a pleasure having you here. And with that, I will just end the session now, seeing that no one else has any questions. Thank you once again for being with us.
Thank you very much for organizing it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone for being here with us. We hope you like the discussion, and we hope that you will keep joining us in such discussions, and we can build a community of thoughts and intellectuals. And yeah, thank you so much.